The alarm did not wake Dr. Marcus Webb on the morning of October 14th, because Dr. Marcus Webb had never gone to sleep. He had been awake for 28 consecutive hours, moving through the cardiac care floor of Hargrove Memorial Hospital the way a river moves through stone. Not forcefully, but with the kind of quiet, relentless purpose that reshapes everything it touches over time. His forest green scrubs were the same ones he had pulled on at 4 o'clock the previous morning. His stethoscope, the one his mother had saved for 11 months to buy him when he was accepted to Johns Hopkins, hung around his neck with the familiar weight of a thing that had become part of his body. He was 38 years old. He had graduated top of his class. He had published 14 peer-reviewed papers on interventional cardiology. He had performed over 2,000 open-heart procedures. And on the left lapel of his scrub top, so small that most people never noticed it, was a gold pin. A small circular seal embossed with the words Chief of Medicine, Hargrove Memorial Hospital, a title he had held for 3 years, earned after a decade of work that had transformed this institution from a struggling regional medical center into one of the top-ranked cardiac care facilities in the entire southeastern United States. But right now, none of that mattered to Marcus Webb. What mattered was Room 412. Room 412 held a 71-year-old man named Gerald Hutchins, a retired school bus driver from Decatur, Georgia, who had been admitted 2 days earlier with a severe aortic blockage that Marcus had personally caught during a routine review of flagged charts. A blockage that 3 other physicians had classified as monitor and observe. Marcus had overruled that classification. He had ordered the additional imaging himself, stayed past midnight to review the results himself, and had personally redesigned Gerald Hutchins' care plan from the ground up, because he had seen something in those scans that told him Gerald Hutchins had maybe 72 hours before that blockage became a catastrophic cardiac event. That had been 48 hours ago. This morning, Gerald Hutchins was stable, improving, and had told Marcus last night, with tears running freely down his weathered brown face, that he had 7 grandchildren who needed him at Christmas. Marcus Webb intended to make sure that happened. He was walking down the corridor toward room 412 with Gerald's updated chart on his clipboard, when he noticed the family gathered outside the door. There were 4 of them. A middle-aged woman who appeared to be Gerald's daughter, a teenage boy slouched against the wall with the particular boneless posture of someone who had been awake too long in an uncomfortable chair, and 2 others who had the red-eyed, coffee-clutching look of people who had driven through the night to get here. They all looked up when Marcus approached. The daughter, a heavy-set woman in her early 40s with Gerald's same warm brown eyes, pressed both hands together and said, "Dr. Webb, thank you. Daddy slept through the night." He actually slept. Marcus smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind that reached the corners of his eyes even through the exhaustion. "That's exactly what we want," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm going to check his morning labs and look at his pressure readings, and then we'll sit down and talk through what the next 48 hours look like. But the trajectory is good. I want you to hold on to that." The daughter grabbed his hand with both of hers and held it. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Marcus squeezed back gently, then pushed open the door to room 412. He had been in this hospital for 11 years. He had started as a third-year resident who ate vending machine sandwiches for dinner and slept in call rooms that smelled like industrial disinfectant and someone else's stress. He had worked nights when the attending physicians went home. He had stayed through holidays, through weekends, through 2 hurricanes and 1 ice storm that had paralyzed the city, while he and a skeleton crew had kept this floor running on generator power and sheer determination. He had watched colleagues leave for higher-paying positions at hospitals in New York and Boston and Los Angeles. He had stayed, not because he couldn't leave. He had been recruited aggressively, 3 times by institutions that would have doubled his salary, given him a research budget, and handed him a corner office with a view. He had stayed because this hospital sat in the middle of a community that had produced him, and because he had made a quiet, private promise to the version of himself who had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment 8 miles from here, watching his father work double shifts and come home gray with fatigue, that he would pour everything he had into this place. And he had. He had restructured the cardiac unit. He had rebuilt the residency program. He had fought for and secured a $4.2 million grant for cardiac care research that had directly expanded treatment options for underinsured patients in the surrounding community. 3 years ago, when the hospital board had elevated him to chief of medicine, the youngest person and the first black physician to hold that title in the hospital's 60-year history, they had done something else as well. They had mounted a bronze dedication plaque in the main cardiac care corridor, just outside the nurse's station, engraved with his name, his title, and a single sentence chosen by the board. In recognition of a physician who chose his community when his community needed him most. Marcus had walked past that plaque every single day for 3 years. He barely noticed it anymore. It was just part of the wall, part of the building, part of the fabric of a place that had become so woven into his identity that he sometimes had to remind himself that he was, in fact, allowed to go home. He checked Gerald Hutchins' morning vitals. He reviewed the overnight nursing notes. He adjusted one medication dosage by a small but significant margin, documented his reasoning in the chart with the precise, methodical thoroughness that his residents had come to both admire and find mildly terrifying, and then he sat for 3 minutes on the small chair beside Gerald's bed while the old man slept. Not reviewing anything, not planning anything, just sitting with the particular stillness of a man who understood, at a bone-deep level, what it meant to still be here. Then he stood, tucked the clipboard under his arm, and walked back out into the corridor. It was 7:43 in the morning. The day shift was beginning to arrive. The hallway held the specific organized energy of a hospital coming to life, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes, the soft chime of monitoring equipment, the low murmur of handoff conversations at the nurse's station. Marcus was thinking about Gerald's medication timing. He was thinking about the second patient he needed to check on, a 54-year-old woman 2 rooms down who had come through a valve replacement surgery 18 hours ago, and whose post-operative numbers he wanted to review personally before he signed out. He was thinking about all of this when he turned the corner near the elevators and walked directly into the kind of moment that he had encountered before, in various forms, in various hallways, in various versions throughout his entire career. The moment when someone looked at him and saw only what they had already decided to see. She was standing near the elevator bank. Pearls. Pink blazer. Blowout blonde hair set so firmly it looked architectural. One hand on her hip, the other hand holding a phone with the practiced readiness of someone who considered public complaints a competitive sport. She was speaking loudly to no one in particular, or rather to everyone within earshot, which is a very specific and deliberate kind of communication, about how long she had been waiting, about the state of this floor, about certain standards she expected and was not receiving. Marcus did not look at her as he passed. He did not need to engage. He had patients to check on. He had a day to finish. He had Gerald Hutchins' 7 grandchildren to think about. But she looked at him, and when she did, something shifted in her face, the particular shift that Marcus had learned to recognize before it became words, before it became a scene, before it became the thing that was about to happen. She looked at his scrubs. She looked at his clipboard. She looked at his tired eyes and his dark skin and the natural, unperformed ease with which he moved through this space as though it belonged to him. Because it did. She looked at all of that and she made a decision. And that decision, that single, catastrophic, public, irreversible decision, was about to unravel everything she thought she was. Marcus Webb turned the corner toward room 414, unaware that the worst moment of someone else's life was approximately 90 seconds away, and that the wall behind her already knew his name. Her name was Diane Cresswell Marsh, and she had never once in her 52 years on this earth stood in a room and not believed, with total cellular certainty, that she was the most important person in it. This was not arrogance in Diane's own estimation. Arrogance implied some gap between belief and reality. Diane Cresswell Marsh had no such gap. She had been raised in a Buckhead household where her father, a real estate developer of the sharp-elbowed, old Atlanta variety, had taught her that the world was divided into 2 categories of people, those who set the terms and those who accepted them. Diane had been trained since birth to be the former. She had internalized this lesson so completely, so early, and so thoroughly that it had long since stopped feeling like a lesson and had simply become the architecture of how she moved through the world. She had married well. Preston Marsh was old money, the kind of old money that didn't need to announce itself because every institution in the city already knew the name. They lived in a home in Buckhead with 6 bedrooms and a wine cellar and a kitchen that had been featured in Atlanta Homes and Lifestyles magazine. She served on the boards of 3 nonprofits, 2 of which were connected to arts organizations and one of which, and this was the detail that would later become remarkable, was the Hargrove Memorial Hospital Foundation, a charitable arm of the very institution she was currently standing in, to which she and Preston had donated a combined total of just over $200,000 across the past 6 years. $200,000. She had reminded people of this figure precisely when it served her, which was often. It was, in her internal accounting, a kind of permanent credit, a standing authorization that entitled her to certain treatments, certain access, certain attitudes from the people whose salaries were, she believed, paid in some spiritual and transactional sense by people exactly like her. She was at Hargrove Memorial this morning because her younger sister, Patrice, had been admitted the previous evening with a cardiac arrhythmia. The condition was serious but manageable. The attending physician on Patrice's case had already spoken with the family the night before, had been thorough and clear, and had indicated that Patrice would very likely be discharged within 48 hours with a medication adjustment and a follow-up plan. By every medical measure, the situation was under control. But Diane Cresswell Marsh did not experience controlled situations as controlled. She experienced them as situations that had not yet received sufficient attention from her. She had arrived at the hospital at 7:15 in the morning, 45 minutes before standard visiting hours began, and had talked her way onto the cardiac floor with a combination of confidence and selective truth-telling that she had refined over decades of similar negotiations. Once on the floor, she had decided, within approximately 4 minutes, that the care being provided to her sister was inadequate, that the nurses were inattentive, that the room was insufficient, and that the general atmosphere of the floor did not reflect the level of investment that families like hers had made in this institution. She was standing near the elevator bank communicating these concerns at conversational volume to anyone within range when the corridor activity around her made her feel invisible, which was the one sensation Diane Cresswell Marsh could not tolerate. And then she saw him. He came around the corner from the direction of the patient rooms, youngish, black, scrubs, clipboard, moving with a focused proprietary ease that, in Diane's processing, did not compute correctly. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't deferring. He wasn't checking in with anyone at the nurse's station as he walked. He was simply moving through the space with the unhurried authority of someone who knew exactly where he was going and had every right to be going there, and something about that ease, that particular unself-conscious authority, snagged on something inside Diane that she would never have named out loud but that lived in her just the same. She made the decision before she had consciously finished making it. "Excuse me," she said, loudly, the way people say things when they want witnesses. Marcus slowed his walk. He looked at her with the patient, professional neutrality of a man who has learned to keep his face very still in moments like this one. "Are you an orderly?" she asked. There was a half-second pause. The pause of a man deciding how to respond to something he has heard before and has never once deserved. "I'm a physician," Marcus said. Diane's eyes dropped to his clipboard, then to his scrubs, then back up to his face with the particular expression of someone performing skepticism for an audience. "A physician," she repeated with the inflection people use when they mean "sure you are." "I've been standing here for 20 minutes and I cannot get a straight answer from anyone about my sister's care. I need to speak to her actual doctor. Not." Her gaze swept him with studied deliberateness. "Whoever is doing rounds." "I understand your concern," Marcus said. His voice was even, professionally even, the kind of even that takes years to develop. "If you can give me your sister's name, I can help direct you to the right." "I don't need to be directed," Diane said, louder now. A nurse at the station had looked up. A family member near one of the rooms had turned. Diane registered the audience the way a performer registers house lights. "I need someone to explain to me why my sister has been on this floor for 12 hours, and I still don't have a clear picture of her treatment plan. Can you get me someone who can actually answer that? Can you get me a real doctor?" The words landed in the hallway and stayed there. A real doctor. Marcus Webb was quiet for 2 full seconds. In those 2 seconds, he was not thinking about Diane Cresswell Marsh. He was thinking about Gerald Hutchins' 7 grandchildren. He was thinking about the medication adjustment he had just documented. He was thinking about the 54-year-old woman 2 rooms down whose post-operative pressure readings he still needed to review before he could sign out and, for the first time in 28 hours, sit down. He was thinking about all of this when Diane Cresswell Marsh reached out and put her hand on his clipboard. Not grabbed it, not snatched it, placed her hand on it with the calm, deliberate entitlement of someone who had never once been told that things do not belong to her. "I'd like to see some actual credentials," she said. "Because I'm sorry, but I have been on the board of this hospital foundation for 6 years, and I have never seen you before. And I would like to know who authorized you to be reviewing patient charts." The hallway had gone quiet. Not completely quiet. Hospitals are never completely quiet. But the particular, charged quiet of a space where multiple people have all simultaneously decided to pay attention to the same thing. And at the nurse's station, 12 feet away, a chair pushed back. And the woman who stood up from that chair had been on this floor for 30 years and had seen many things, but she had a line, a hard, bright, non-negotiable line, and Diane Cresswell Marsh had just walked across it. Her name was Nurse Supervisor Carolyn James, and she was already moving. Carolyn James had not always been a large woman, but she had always had a large presence, the kind that did not require volume or velocity to communicate itself. She was 58 years old, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped natural hair that had gone fully silver at 50 and which she had decided, upon the first appearance of that silver, to simply let be. She wore her navy blue charge nurse uniform the way judges wear robes, not as a costume, but as an extension of an authority that existed independently of what she was wearing. She had worked on the cardiac floor of Hargrove Memorial for 30 years, 3 months, and 11 days. She had outlasted 7 hospital administrators, for different ownership structures, 2 major renovations, and more physicians than she could count. Some brilliant, some mediocre, some who had burned bright and fast and moved on, and some who had grown into the kind of steady, permanent excellence that became the foundation everything else was built on. Marcus Webb was the latter kind. She had known it from the first week he had arrived on her floor as a third-year resident. Not because he was the smartest person in the room, though he often was, but because of the way he listened. Most residents listened to nurses the way people listen to elevator music, processing the surface noise without actually absorbing it. Marcus had listened the way a person listens when they understand that the person talking knows something they need to know. He had asked her questions. He had taken notes. He had come back and asked follow-up questions. He had, on 3 separate occasions during his residency, made clinical decisions that Carolyn's quiet observations had shaped, decisions that had, on 2 of those occasions, directly prevented patient harm. In 30 years, she could count on one hand the number of residents who had done that. She had watched him grow from that resident into an attending. She had watched him publish his first paper, deliver his first grand rounds presentation, lose his first patient in a way that had taken something from him and given something back in its place, the particular gravity that good physicians carry after they have truly understood the weight of what they are doing. She had watched him be passed over for a department head position in his 6th year by a committee that had cited cultural fit in language so transparent that Carolyn had gone home that night and cried at her kitchen table. Not because she was surprised, but because she was tired of not being surprised. She had watched him not quit. She had watched him not diminish. She had watched him continue with the same focused, relentless excellence, and she had watched the institution eventually be forced, by the undeniable, unignorable, accumulated weight of what he had built, to recognize what it had been looking directly at for a decade. She had been on this floor the day they installed the plaque. She had stood in the hallway with a small group of nurses and administrators and watched them affix it to the wall, and she had looked at Marcus's face when he read it for the first time, that quick, private expression he had made before the professional composure reassembled itself, and she had understood exactly what that expression contained. She had understood it because she had been watching this man do extraordinary things in ordinary ways for 11 years, and she knew what it cost to keep doing that in a world that sometimes required you to prove you belonged in rooms you had, in fact, built. So when she looked up from the nurse's station and saw Diane Cresswell Marsh's hand on Marcus Webb's clipboard, on his clipboard in his corridor, outside his patients' rooms, in the building that bore his name on a bronze plaque 3 feet behind the woman who had apparently never learned to read walls, something moved through Carolyn James that was not quite anger, because anger is hot and what moved through her was very cold and very clear. She stood up. She pushed back her chair. She came around the nurse's station. She did not rush. Carolyn James did not rush. Rushing implied uncertainty, and she had none. She walked at the pace of someone who has already decided what is going to happen. Behind her, she was dimly aware of 2 other nurses pausing their work, of a family member near room 416 stepping slightly back, of the particular quality of silence that falls over a hallway when everyone in it simultaneously understands that they are about to witness something they will be describing to other people for years. Carolyn reached Diane Cresswell Marsh and stopped 2 feet away from her. She looked at the hand on the clipboard. She looked at it for 2 full seconds without speaking, the way you look at something you want everyone present to have also seen and registered and understood. Then she said, in a voice that was not loud but carried to every corner of that corridor with absolute clarity, "Ma'am, I need you to take your hand off that." Diane turned to look at her with the expression she used for people who had interrupted her. "Excuse me, I was just off," Carolyn said. One word. The temperature of it dropped the hallway by several degrees. Diane's hand came off the clipboard. Carolyn stepped between Diane and Marcus with the deliberateness of someone drawing a line with their body. She did not look at Marcus. She looked at Diane. "I heard what you said. I want to make sure I heard it correctly, because what I heard is going to determine what happens in the next 5 minutes. You asked this physician to produce credentials. You questioned whether he was authorized to review patient charts. And you used the phrase." Carolyn paused with the precision of someone who chooses each word the way a surgeon chooses an instrument. "Real doctor." Diane's chin lifted. "I'm on the hospital foundation board and I have every right to." "I know who you are," Carolyn said. The calm in her voice was not gentle. It was geological. "And I need you to turn around." Something in Diane's face flickered. Just briefly. The first small fracture in the surface of a thing that was about to break open entirely. "Turn around," Carolyn said again. "And read the wall behind you." Diane Cresswell Marsh turned around. She looked at the wall. She found the plaque. It took perhaps 3 seconds, which meant it was not small, which meant it was not obscure, which meant it was exactly as visible as it had always been to anyone who had ever chosen to see what was actually in front of them. She read it. The hallway held its breath. Carolyn watched Diane read. She watched the exact moment the words assembled themselves into meaning. She watched the meaning land. She watched what happened in a person's body when they realize, in a single, public, irreversible instant, the precise dimensions of what they have done. Behind Carolyn, Marcus Webb was quiet. He had not moved. He stood with the clipboard in his hand and the stethoscope around his neck and 28 hours of exhaustion in his eyes and the complete, unruffled dignity of a man who had never needed a plaque to know who he was, but who was, in this moment, perhaps grateful that the wall remembered. Diane turned back around. Her face was a different face than the one she had arrived with. And Carolyn James was already reaching for the incident tablet in her scrub pocket. Because documentation, she had learned in 30 years, is the other kind of justice. The kind that outlasts the moment, the kind that follows people out of corridors and into boardrooms and into the permanent record of what a person actually did when they thought the walls weren't watching. The walls were always watching. This one had a name on it to prove it. The bronze plaque was 14 inches wide and 10 inches tall. It had been manufactured by a specialty engraving company in Birmingham, Alabama, and it had been installed on the wall of the cardiac care corridor at Hargrove Memorial Hospital on a Thursday afternoon in March 3 years ago, by a facilities technician named Bobby Okafor, who had used a level 3 times to make sure it was perfectly straight because he had been told, by the nursing staff, exactly whose name was on it, and he wanted to get it right. The text was clean and simple, engraved in a serif typeface on brushed bronze with a hospital crest in the upper left corner. Dr. Marcus A. Webb, MD FACC, Chief of Medicine, Hargrove Memorial Hospital. In recognition of a physician who chose his community when his community needed him most. It did not say that Marcus Webb had grown up 8 miles from this hospital in a 2-bedroom apartment where the hot water heater was unreliable and the windows let in winter cold through the gaps in the frames, and where his mother had worked the overnight shift at a laundry service 4 nights a week so that the bills stayed paid and the lights stayed on and her son stayed in a school district good enough to see what he was. It did not say that Marcus's father, a man named Arthur Webb who drove a city bus for 23 years, had taken him to the public library every Saturday morning from the time Marcus was 5 years old, because Arthur Webb had understood, with a clarity born of personal experience, that the world his son was going to have to navigate would require him to be not merely good but extraordinary, and that extraordinariness required fuel, and that fuel lived in books. It did not say that Marcus had applied to 11 medical schools and been waitlisted at 3 and rejected by 4 before Johns Hopkins had looked at his application and seen what was there. The grades that had been exceptional, yes, but also the personal statement that one admissions reader had passed to a colleague with a handwritten note that said simply, "This one." It did not say that during his second year of medical school, Marcus's father had had a heart attack. Mild, as heart attacks go, survivable, thank God, and that Marcus had sat in a hospital waiting room in Atlanta for 4 hours while his mother held his hand and prayed quietly, and that when the cardiologist finally came out and sat down with them and explained in careful, unhurried human language exactly what had happened and exactly what was going to happen next, something had clicked into place in Marcus Webb's understanding of what he was being trained to do. Not just the medicine, the conversation, the way a physician could walk into a waiting room and either add to the terror or reduce it, and how that choice, that entirely human, relational, non-medical choice, was as important as anything that happened in the operating room. He had gone back to Johns Hopkins and shifted his focus to cardiology the following semester. It did not say any of this. It was a plaque, not a biography. But the people who worked on this floor knew. Carolyn James knew. The nurses who had watched him work for a decade knew. Gerald Hutchins, waking up in room 412 with 7 grandchildren still waiting for him, was learning it in real time through his own body, through the particular gift of continued existence. Diane Cresswell Marsh was only now, standing in a corridor with her hand no longer on a clipboard, beginning to understand the first surface layer of what she had walked into. She was processing the plaque. She was processing the name. She was beginning to do the arithmetic, the slow, horrible arithmetic of someone calculating how wrong they were and in how many directions simultaneously. Chief of Medicine. She was on the foundation board. She had been to 3 hospital galas in the past 18 months. She had written checks with Preston's name on them and stood in receiving lines and smiled for photographs with administrators whose faces she did not always remember by the following morning. She had networked in this building. She had treated this building as an extension of the social architecture of her life. A venue, a context, a place where her status had meaning and her donations had weight. And somewhere in that building, in those galas, in those receiving lines, she must have encountered his name. It must have been spoken. It must have appeared on a program or a nameplate or a letter signed by the hospital's senior staff. The chief of medicine would have been present at those events, would have been introduced. The mathematics of her own inattention was devastating. She opened her mouth. Carolyn James looked at her with the expression of someone who has already decided how much of what is about to be said they are interested in hearing, which was, none of it. "I'm going to tell you what's going to happen," Carolyn said. Her voice still that same geological calm that had never wavered. "I'm going to call patient security to escort you to the lobby. While that's happening, I am going to document this incident, the physical contact with hospital property, the verbal challenge to a physician's credentials, all of it, in the official incident report system, which means it becomes part of this hospital's permanent record. Dr. Webb has patients to see, and he is going to go see them. You are going to wait in the lobby, and if your sister's care team determines it's appropriate for you to return to this floor today, they will authorize that. But that decision is not mine, and it is not yours, and it is absolutely not going to be made in this hallway this morning." Diane said, "I would like to speak to." "There is no one above him in this building," Carolyn said. "That is what chief of medicine means." The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence, the kind that comes after a door closes. Final. Complete. Marcus Webb looked at Carolyn. Something passed between them, not words, not even exactly an expression. Just the acknowledgement of 2 people who have known each other for a long time and have, together, been through many versions of many things, and who understand that some moments do not require commentary. He gave a small nod. Then he turned and walked down the corridor toward room 414 because he had a patient to check on, and because he had always understood, at a level below words, at the level of the person he had decided to be long before any plaque existed to confirm it, that the work was the answer. The work had always been the answer. Not the argument, not the confrontation, not the demand to be seen. The work. The patients. Gerald Hutchins. The grandchildren at Christmas. He pushed open the door to room 414. Behind him, in the corridor, he heard Carolyn begin to speak again, and then he heard the distinct sound of the incident tablet notification tone, and then he let the door close behind him and gave his full attention to the woman in the bed who had been through open-heart surgery 18 hours ago and deserved a physician who was completely present. The wall held his name. It didn't need his attention. It had done its job. Stands up. Carolyn James had a phrase she used with nursing students during orientation, a phrase she had developed sometime in her second decade on the floor and had refined through repetition into something she now delivered with the clean efficiency of a clinical finding. Documentation is the second surgery. The first surgery fixed the immediate problem. The second surgery, the documentation, the record, the formal account, determined whether the fix held. It determined whether the lesson was learned or merely endured. It was the part most people skipped when they were tired or busy or convinced that what had happened was obvious enough to require no further inscription into the permanent record. Carolyn had seen, in 30 years, the consequences of that skipping. She had watched situations that should have had outcomes fail to produce them because no one had taken the time to write it down in the right language in the right system at the right time. She was not going to skip this. She was seated at the nurse's station, her incident tablet open, and she was constructing the report with the methodical care she brought to every document she produced, which was, her colleagues knew, considerable care. Carolyn wrote incident reports the way architects draw plans. With absolute precision, with full awareness of how the document would be used by people who hadn't been there, with language chosen not for drama but for unimpeachable clarity. At approximately 7:43 a.m., charge nurse observed visitor, identified as Diane Cresswell Marsh, listed as Foundation board member, verbally challenged the credentials of Dr. Marcus Webb, Chief of Medicine, in the main cardiac care corridor. Visitor questioned Dr. Webb's authorization to review patient charts and requested that he provide actual credentials. Visitor made physical contact with Dr. Webb's clipboard without consent. Upon intervention by charge nurse, visitor was verbally informed of Dr. Webb's identity and title. Visitor was asked to vacate the floor pending security escort. Visitor did not immediately comply. Security was contacted at 7:49 a.m. Visitor was escorted to the lobby at 7:54 a.m. She read it back. Every sentence was accurate. Every sentence was documented in the language of hospital policy and procedure. Every sentence would survive review by an administrator, a legal team, or a board committee. She was not editorializing. She did not need to. The facts, arranged in their correct sequence, were editorial enough. She filed the report. She forwarded it to the hospital administrator on duty. She forwarded it to the chief of staff. She forwarded it, after a moment's consideration, to the vice president of operations, whose office oversaw Foundation board relations, because the nature of this incident, given who was involved, made that forwarding appropriate and necessary. Then she set the tablet down and looked up. The security officer, a young man named Deshawn whom Carolyn had watched grow from a nervous 22-year-old on his first shift into a steady, reliable presence over the past 4 years, was standing near the elevator with Diane Cresswell Marsh. Diane had not made it easy. She had attempted, in the 11 minutes since Carolyn's initial intervention, 3 separate approaches to the situation. First, the entitled approach, invoking her board membership, her donations, her relationship with named hospital administrators. Then the wounded approach, expressing shock, dismay, and aversion of the events in which her intentions had been entirely reasonable and her reception entirely disproportionate. And then, when both of those had encountered Carolyn's implacable documentation and Deshawn's polite, practiced immovability, something closer to the truth, which was a woman who had done something she could not undo and was beginning to fully register the dimensions of it. The elevator arrived. Diane stepped in. She turned and looked down the corridor one more time before the doors closed. Not at Carolyn, who was watching her with no expression in particular, and not at Deshawn, who was watching her with the professional neutral courtesy that security staff are trained to maintain. She looked at the plaque. One more time, with an expression that contained, in approximately equal measure, humiliation, and the very beginning, just the very first edge, of something that in another person, in another kind of story, might eventually become understanding. The doors closed. Carolyn James watched the elevator doors and then she let out a breath. Not a long breath, not a dramatic breath, just the small, involuntary exhale of a woman who has been holding herself in the precise posture required by a demanding moment and is now, the moment having resolved, permitted to be slightly more human. Nurse Priya Nair, 26 years old, 2 years on the floor, appeared at Carolyn's elbow. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That woman really didn't know." "No," Carolyn said. "She didn't." "How do you not know?" Priya said. It wasn't rhetorical. She genuinely wanted to understand. Carolyn considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, because Priya was asking something real and the answer mattered. "When people decide what they're looking at before they look," she said, "they stop taking in information. They're not seeing anymore. They're confirming." She picked up the tablet again. "That's not a knowledge problem. That's a vision problem. And nobody on this floor can fix it. They have to fix it themselves, if they're going to fix it at all." Priya was quiet. "Get back to your rounds," Carolyn said, not unkindly. "Mr. Hutchins in 412 needs his 8 o'clock pressure check. Make sure you document the reading and flag it to Dr. Webb's chart update queue. He may be signing out in the next hour, and he'll want the number before he leaves." Priya went. Carolyn sat for a moment longer at the nurse's station, in the quiet that the corridor had returned to, the working quiet, the purposeful quiet, the sound of a floor doing what it was built to do. The plaque on the wall caught the morning light from the window at the end of the hallway. It held the light without comment. 30 years, Carolyn thought. 30 years of floors like this one. 30 years of mornings like this one. 30 years of moments where the weight of what this work actually meant, and what it actually cost, and what it actually required from the people who chose to do it. All of that weight pressing down on the spaces between the fluorescent lights and the monitored heartbeats and the clipboards and the plaques. She had seen physicians break under that weight. She had seen some bend in ways that changed them permanently. She had seen Marcus Webb carry it for 11 years with a posture that never showed the strain, and she had understood for a very long time that this was not because the weight wasn't there. It was because of where he had put it. Not on his shoulders, but in his hands, where it became the work, where it became Gerald Hutchins' stable vitals and the adjusted medication dosage and the 3 minutes sitting in the chair beside a sleeping patient just to be present with the fact of his continued life. She was proud of him. She had never said it in those words. But she was. She pulled up the day's staffing sheet and got back to work. The email arrived at 9:17 a.m. It landed simultaneously in the inboxes of all 7 active members of the Hargrove Memorial Hospital Foundation Board, sent by the hospital's vice president of operations, a woman named Sandra Osei, whose professional reputation was built on 2 qualities that people who worked with her described in the same breath. She was fair, and she was fast. When Sandra Osei determined that something needed to be addressed, it was addressed before the business day was over. This was not ruthlessness. It was, in Sandra's own understanding, respect for the institution, for the people in it, and for the principle that silence about serious things was its own kind of statement. The email was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph described, in factual language, the incident that had occurred at 7:43 a.m. on the cardiac care floor. The second paragraph noted that the incident had been formally documented in the hospital's incident reporting system and had been forwarded to her office in accordance with protocol. The third paragraph stated that given the nature of the incident, specifically, the identity of the physician involved and the board membership of the individual in question, an emergency board review would be convened within 72 hours to determine appropriate next steps. It did not contain the word consequences. It did not need to. By 9:45 a.m., 5 of the 7 board members had replied. 4 of the replies were variations of the same message. "I am deeply troubled by this. Please count on my full participation in the review." The 5th was longer, more carefully worded, and came from a board member named Richard Calloway, who had known Preston Marsh since their days at the same Atlanta prep school 30 years ago. Richard's email was sympathetic to Diane in its framing without being explicitly defensive, and it asked several questions about process and documentation that Sandra recognized as the preliminary architecture of a mitigation strategy. She filed his email without replying and made a note to ensure that the documentation Carolyn James had produced was available in its complete form for the board review. Documentation, she had learned over 20 years in hospital administration, was the thing that made mitigation strategies collapse. Not because it was adversarial, but because it was simply true. You couldn't argue with a timestamp. You couldn't reframe a direct quote. You couldn't suggest that the incident had been mischaracterized when it had been recorded in clinical language by a 30-year charge nurse whose professional credibility was, to put it plainly, unimpeachable. She also placed a call, at 10 a.m., to the hospital's general counsel. Not because she expected litigation, the hospital was not the aggrieved party in any legal sense, but because she wanted to be certain that every procedural step taken from this point forward was documented and defensible in the event that the Marsh family's attorneys attempted to reframe the narrative in any direction. Counsel's advice was brief. Follow protocol, document everything, and let the facts speak. Sandra Osei had never needed to be told that twice. Meanwhile, in a way that Sandra could not have prevented even if she had tried, the morning's events had moved through the hospital the way significant events move through any community of people who work closely together in high-stakes conditions. Quietly, quickly, and with a fidelity to the essential truth of what had happened that rumors rarely achieve, but this particular story seemed, by some quality of its own weight, to maintain. Nurses told nurses. Residents told residents. A patient's family member who had been in the corridor at 7:43 a.m. texted their adult child, who posted a version of the story on social media with enough identifying institutional details that by mid-afternoon it had been shared several hundred times and had attracted the attention of a journalist who covered healthcare equity for a regional outlet. Marcus Webb knew none of this. At 10:30 a.m., having completed his patient rounds, having reviewed his final chart updates, having verified Gerald Hutchins' morning vitals personally and stopped for 4 minutes to talk with Gerald's daughter in the hallway, during which he had squeezed his hand again and he had told her, with genuine confidence, that her father was going to be at Christmas, Marcus Webb had signed out, walked to the staff locker room, changed out of his scrubs and driven home. He had been asleep by 11. He slept for 9 hours. His phone was on silent. He had no idea. In the lobby of the hospital, at approximately 10 a.m., Diane Cresswell Marsh had sat for 20 minutes in a chair near the entrance, staring at nothing in particular. Deshawn had waited with her until Preston arrived. She had called him from the elevator, and he had come immediately because Preston Marsh was the kind of husband who showed up, and had watched Preston guide her to the exit with his hand on her back and an expression that was equal parts concern and a particular brand of marital recognition. You did a thing, and now we have to deal with the thing. Patrice, Diane's sister, was discharged 41 hours later, entirely healthy, with a care plan that had been developed by the physician her sister had tried to remove from the corridor. She would not learn what had happened until the following week. When she did, she cried, not from shame, though there was shame, but from the specific exhaustion of loving someone who keeps making it necessary for you to apologize for them, and from the profound and disorienting gratitude of knowing that the doctor who had been treated that way had still, without hesitation, continued to care for her with the same unaltered thoroughness he brought to every patient, because that was who he was, and because that was what the work required, and because his character had never been contingent on how he was treated. She sent him a card. He kept it. Marcus woke at 7:30 the following morning, the first natural, alarm-free waking he had allowed himself in 4 days, and he lay in the specific stillness of a person reclaiming their own body from the institution that had borrowed it. His apartment was quiet. He had a one-bedroom in a building 12 minutes from the hospital, chosen for the commute and maintained with the sparse, functional order of a person who spent most of their waking hours somewhere else. There were books, cardiology texts, and journal collections on the shelf in the living room, but also James Baldwin and Toni Morrison and Colson Whitehead and Ta-Nehisi Coates and a battered paperback copy of The Warmth of Other Suns that he had read 3 times. There was a framed photograph on the dresser. His mother and father at his medical school graduation, his mother in the yellow dress she had saved for and his father in the suit that still fit him, both of them wearing expressions that Marcus had looked at so many times he had memorized every detail. The way his father's jaw was set with a pride so enormous it had required a kind of visible physical containment, and the way his mother was simply crying, without any attempt at containment at all. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table. He checked his phone for the first time since he had put it on silent the previous morning. 47 text messages, 19 missed calls, 11 voicemails, and a notification from his personal email that he had received, in the past 18 hours, over 200 new messages. He stared at the screen for a moment. He opened the first text. It was from Carolyn James, sent the previous afternoon. You need to know what happened after you left. Call me when you're rested. All good. Just need you to be informed. He called her. She answered on the second ring, and she told him, in the same factual, unembellished language she brought to incident reports, what had happened after he had walked into room 414. The documentation, the escort, the email to the board, the social media attention, the journalist inquiry. He was quiet for a long moment after she finished. "Are you okay?" she asked. Carolyn James did not ask that question casually. "I'm okay," he said. And then, after another pause, "Carolyn." "Yes. Thank you." There was a quality to those two words, something in the register of his voice, something that the 28 hours of work and the particular events of the previous morning had stripped down to its true substance, that made Carolyn James, alone in her kitchen with her own morning coffee, close her eyes for just a moment. "That's my floor," she said. "That's my job." "It's more than your job," he said. "And you know it." She did know it. "Get some breakfast," she said, "and stay off social media for another 24 hours. Nothing good comes from looking at it." He laughed. It was a real laugh. Surprised and genuine and tired and warm. "Yes, ma'am." He stayed off social media. He made breakfast. He called his mother. His mother, Vera Webb, 64 years old, retired from the laundry service and now working part-time at a community center 3 mornings a week because she was constitutionally incapable of doing nothing, listened to the story without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When he finished, she was quiet for long enough that he checked to make sure the call was still connected. Then she said, "Your father rode that city bus for 23 years, Marcus. He drove right past that hospital every Tuesday and Thursday. I don't know if you knew that." He hadn't. "He would have driven past that plaque," she said, "if he'd lived to see it." Her voice held no self-pity. It was simply a fact, offered with the particular grace of a woman who had long since learned to hold hard things without being consumed by them. "He knew who you were going to be before you knew. That woman in that hallway. She doesn't know who she is, Marcus. That's what's wrong with her. It's not about you. It's never been about you." He held the phone with both hands. "It doesn't hurt less," he said quietly. "Knowing it's not about me. It still lands." "I know it does," she said. "Of course it does. You're allowed to feel all of that. But you don't carry it, Marcus. You put it down when you walk in that door. You understand me? You put it down." He understood her. He had been putting it down version by version, incident by incident, for 38 years. Not because the weight wasn't real. Not because the accumulation of 1,000 small moments like yesterday's, and the not-so-small moments, and the moments that had happened to colleagues and friends and patients and every black physician he had ever known, didn't add up to something enormous that lived in the body and required active maintenance to carry without being crushed by it. But because the alternative was to stop. And stopping was not something Marcus Webb was made for. His mother asked about Gerald Hutchins. He told her about the grandchildren and Christmas. She made a sound of deep satisfaction. They talked for another 20 minutes about nothing important, about her garden, about a book she was reading, about a neighbor's new dog that had complicated opinions about the mail carrier, and by the time they said goodbye, Marcus felt something in his chest that had been tight for days release slowly, like a hand unclenching. He washed his coffee cup. He put on shoes. He went for a walk. The neighborhood was October quiet. The particular Atlanta October that was not yet cool, but had lost the aggressive heat of summer and settled into something gentler. The light coming through the changing trees at an angle that suggested the year was preparing to turn. He walked for 40 minutes without a destination, and he thought about Gerald Hutchins, and he thought about his father on the bus, and he thought about the plaque on the wall that he rarely looked at anymore, and he thought about Carolyn James standing up from her chair. He thought, "This is what it looks like when people choose to see you." He thought, "This is what it costs when they don't." He thought, "I am going to go back to that floor tomorrow, and I am going to do the work because the work is the answer, and it has always been the answer, and it will still be the answer on every morning that comes after this one." He walked home. He ate dinner. He slept well. The emergency board review of the Hargrove Memorial Hospital Foundation was convened 68 hours after the incident in the cardiac care corridor, in a conference room on the hospital's administrative floor, and it lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Diane Cresswell Marsh did not attend. She had submitted a letter, drafted, the board's more experienced members could tell, with significant legal assistance. that expressed regret for the incident, characterized her actions as arising from concern for her sister's care rather than any intentional disrespect, and requested that the matter be resolved privately and without further escalation. The board read the letter. Sandra Osei presented the incident documentation. The vice president of HR presented the hospital's stated values and code of conduct as they pertained to the treatment of medical staff. The general counsel outlined the hospital's obligations under its own policies regarding documented violations. Richard Calloway made the sympathetic argument he had been preparing since his email the previous morning. He was the only one who made it. The other 6 board members sat with the documentation in front of them and the values statement on the screen and asked their questions and listened to the answers, and by the time the vote was called, it was unanimous, with Calloway abstaining rather than voting against. The outcome was what the facts had always suggested it would be. Diane Cresswell Marsh was removed from the Hargrove Memorial Hospital Foundation Board, effective immediately. She was permanently prohibited from the cardiac care floor and required to provide advance notice to the administration before any future visit to the facility. A formal letter documenting the board's decision and its reasons was placed in the foundation's records, which meant, practically speaking, that it would be discoverable by any of the other charitable boards and organizations with which she was affiliated, should they choose to look. Whether they would look was not the hospital's concern. What happened after that was not the hospital's to control. What was the hospital's, what had always been the hospital's, what would always be the hospital's, was the standard it held itself to in the space between its own walls. The standard that said, "The person who walks through this door deserving care will receive it. The person who has dedicated their career to this work will be defended in it. The record will reflect what actually happened, not what was convenient to remember." Marcus was informed of the board's decision by Sandra Osei in a phone call that lasted 6 minutes. She was factual, as she always was, and she closed the call by saying something that Sandra Osei, a woman not given to speeches, said rarely. "I want you to know, Marcus, that this institution does not take for granted what you have given it. I know that's easy to say and harder to demonstrate, but I want to say it." He thanked her. He meant it. And then he went back to the hospital because Gerald Hutchins had hit a new milestone in his recovery, 3 days ahead of projection, and had asked the nursing staff, with the absolute sincerity of a 71-year-old man who had been very close to a very different outcome, whether Dr. Webb might have a minute. Marcus had more than a minute. He sat in the chair beside Gerald's bed, and Gerald, a retired school bus driver from Decatur, Georgia, a man who had spent 30 years driving children to the places they needed to go, a man whose hands were weathered and whose eyes were warm and who had 7 grandchildren who needed him at Christmas. Gerald took Marcus's hand in both of his, the way his daughter had done in the hallway 3 days ago. "My daughter told me what happened," Gerald said. "In the hallway. That woman." Marcus looked at him. "I want you to know," Gerald said, "that I have known a lot of doctors in my life, and you are the best one. Not because of that plaque, son. Because of who you were before there was a plaque." Marcus Webb, Chief of Medicine of Hargrove Memorial Hospital, author of 14 peer-reviewed papers, performer of 2,000 open-heart surgeries, the first black physician to hold his title in 60 years of institutional history, a man who had been told in 100 different ways and hallways that he needed to prove what had never required proving, sat in a hospital chair beside a recovering patient and felt, for a moment, the full and unguarded weight of being seen. Not the plaque kind of seen. Not the institution kind. The human kind. The kind his father had given him at 5 years old in a public library. The kind his mother had given him in a yellow dress at graduation. The kind Carolyn James gave him every time she stood up from her chair. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're going to make it to Christmas, Gerald." Gerald smiled. "I know I am," he said, "because you told me so." Outside, in the corridor, the plaque held the light. On the floor, the work continued, the monitors and the footsteps and the quiet, constant, unbroken labor of people who had chosen to be in the rooms where life hangs in the balance and has chosen to hang on. Nurses at their stations. Residents reviewing charts. Families in waiting rooms holding coffee and hope in equal measure. And in room 412, a doctor and a patient sat together in the particular piece of 2 people who had, against some odds, found their way to the same moment. One having fought to preserve a life, one having had his life preserved, and who understood, without needing to say it, that this was the point of everything. This, not the plaques, not the titles, not the boards and the votes and the documentation and the consequences delivered and the records set straight. This a handheld, promise kept, a man going home to his grandchildren because someone had chosen, above all other available options, to simply do the work. In the end, that is what the walls remember. Not the noise, not the entitlement, not the moment someone tried to erase a name they didn't recognize. The walls remember the name, and the name was there long before anyone thought to put it in bronze.